CR 1522, there are a lot of questions for Dr. Woodcock, and the record should reflect that Dr. Woodcock is outside the courtroom as well. The first question is on the form that I have marked as 196, and the question is, in your personal opinion, do you believe all people who have delusions and who murder are legally insane? Any objection, Mr. King?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection, Mr. Brockler?
No, sir.
I will ask it. It's appropriate. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 197. The question is, whose opinion specifically, if you recall, was it that the defendant's apartment devices were set up incorrectly? Or was it a specific agency? If so, which agency? Any objection, Mr. King?
Judge, I would object as asked and answered. I think Mr. Brockler asked a series of questions about that, and Dr. Woodcock indicated he did not know where that information had come from.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I think it's an appropriate question. I will ask it over the defense's objection. I think that there were some questions along the lines of this topic that were asked, but I'm not sure if this particular question was asked or if the information that this question is attempting to elicit was elicited, and even if it was, it's possible that the juror missed it. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 198, and this question has a couple of questions. This question form has a couple of questions. The first question on question form number 198 is, from an ethical standpoint, do you stand by your decision/opinion of insanity based on 2 hours of interviewing and reviewing others' reports, not viewing everything on your own, and basing your decision partially subjectively, picking and choosing information from others' reports, especially with the nature of the possible outcomes for the defendant? Mr. King?
Judge, I would object. He's testified as to what he based his opinions on and how strongly he feels about those opinions, and this is a compound question and it seems somewhat argumentative, so I would object.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
I agree that this seems more like an argument, and I think his answer that he's provided an opinion. He obviously feels it's an ethical opinion or he wouldn't be rendering it. The second question on this form is as follows. Is it true that cognitive testing scores can change based on the length of the time between testing, who is administering the testing, how he is feeling that day? Could the scores go back up or down if tested again? Could this be affected by medication or medications? Mr. King?
Judge, I would object as that's beyond the scope of his expertise. We're going to have at least 3 psychologists who are going to testify about testing and how it works and what affects the testing, and they're really the experts in that area. And this witness didn't administer psychological testing, nor is he an expert in that area as a psychiatrist, so I would object to that question.
I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Brockler, do you have a different position?
I do, Your Honor. If you'll recall, Mr. King on redirect asked him to opine on the significance of decreased scores as they relate to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And the witness actually did opine on that. I think if the court were to ask this question from the standpoint of if you know, that would probably cover the concerns that Mr. King has as well as address this juror's concern.
And Judge, just to jump in, the question that I asked him to opine was based, I specifically asked him as a neurologist, do you have an opinion about declining IQ as it relates to this psychotic illness? Those questions didn't relate to the testing itself and the validity of the testing instruments themselves, whether medication would affect the testing. Those are all technical issues that relate to the administration of the test and not to decline in intelligence generally in schizophrenia.
Well, but I think if you asked him about the test results, I mean, and he testified about that and how they change from one year to the next, I think the question is appropriate. So after looking at it again and remembering the testimony, I will allow it, but I will add if you know. I think it's an appropriate question given the testimony that was elicited on redirect examination. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 199. The question is, when do you believe that Mr. Holmes's delusions took over his ability to know right from wrong? Any objection, Mr. King?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection, Mr. Brockler?
None, Your Honor.
It's an appropriate question. I will ask it. The next three questions are on the form that I have marked as number 200. Does being delusional automatically preclude the ability to know right from wrong or to form a culpable mental state? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Brockler?
No, sir.
Okay, it's an appropriate question. I will ask it. Next, on the same form, does being psychotic automatically do the same? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
I agree it's appropriate. And then finally, if the answer to 1 or 2 is no, what evidence beyond delusions and psychosis did you see that led to your opinion that the defendant was legally sane? Any objection?
Was legally sane?
Legally sane.
Well, I think that's confusing because that was not his opinion, so...
I think what the juror meant was to refer to the testimony that dealt with the defendant having the capacity to know right from wrong under the law, to know that something is legal or illegal, as opposed to legal sanity. And there was some conversation about that, but it is a confusing question, so I'm assuming you're objecting.
I'm objecting because it's confusing and seems to misunderstand his testimony, I guess.
Mr. Brockler?
I don't have a position, Your Honor.
All right, I will not ask that question. I think it's a confusing question, and I'm not going to speculate about what the juror meant. I think I know what the juror meant, but I can't be sure, and I'm not going to speculate about it. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 201. This one also has a few questions. The first question is, if someone is suffering from catatonia, is it possible, in your opinion, for that person to be able to schedule these episodes? And schedule is in quotes, in quotation marks. Mr. King?
Schedule episodes of catatonia?
Right. It says, if someone is suffering from catatonia, is it possible, in your opinion, for that person to be able to schedule these episodes?
I guess I would object, Judge. We went over this with him, both Mr. Brockler and I, and he testified when both parties questioned him that he didn't think that Mr. Holmes was actually suffering from catatonia. So I don't think it's relevant, and I would object.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
I think it's an appropriate question. It came up in the testimony. There was a reference to catatonia and the defendant making some arrangements for any symptoms during the lunch hour, and then there was additional testimony to clarify that, but there were questions about this and there was testimony about this, so I think it's an appropriate question, and I'm not sure that this specific question was answered or covered, and if it was, it's possible that this particular juror missed it. Next, in your experience, is it common for a person with schizoaffective disorder to be or to become violent? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I agree it's an appropriate question. Next, are the questions in the checklist in the insanity defense chapter mandatory to ask in terms of forensic psychiatry and rendering a forensic opinion, or just a suggested guideline? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
It's an appropriate question. I will ask it. The next multiple questions are on the form that I have marked as number 202. The first question is, how does a person with schizophrenia change in the early to mid-20s? Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
It's an appropriate question. I will ask it. Next, on the same form, aside from the homicidal ideations, why did you rule out an autism spectrum disorder in that the defendant allegedly had a flat affect and poor social skills for many years, if not always. Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
The next question on the same form, if Mr. Holmes had no empathy for others, as you reported, how did you rule out antisocial personality disorder aside from no rule-breaking history? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, sir.
All right, it's an appropriate question. I will ask it. And the final question on the form, actually there are two more questions on the form. The next question on the same form, per your testimony, how did you know that Mr. Holmes was psychotic when he went backwards off the bed? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
The last, and I agree that it's appropriate. The last question on this form. When you reviewed the police video, did you see the calendar with the dates of July 19 or 20th marked with a symbol? And then underneath in parentheses it says, when you consider the defendant did not know the date of the event. So, Mr. King?
I guess I would object, Judge, because there has been no video of the apartment shown to this jury, and this specifically references a video
I think there was a photograph, but not a video.
of the bedroom. That's right.
All right, Mr. Brockler?
Yes, Your Honor, to the extent that the question can be changed to reflect that piece of evidence, if that's the issue that they're getting to, I'd ask the court to do that and ask the question. Your Honor, may I say something else?
Yes.
It occurs to me, and I don't know that this is the case, that the jurors may also be trying to test Dr. Woodcock's memory of even what the evidence is in this case, and they may have intentionally listed it as a video to see what he would say.
Instead of being as specific as the police video, I would change it to when you reviewed the reports, the police reports. Is that okay with the defense? I mean, I know you object to the question, but I think it's an appropriate question. It's just that this juror apparently is remembering wrong. It's not the video that showed the calendar. It's a photograph that showed the calendar. And this juror is asking Dr. Woodcock if he is aware of that calendar.
Well, I guess it's not the police reports that would reflect that either. It was a photograph that was shown to the jury, Judge. So I'm objecting to trying to rewrite the juror's question. I would object to the question. The juror is specifically asking about video. There is no video. I just don't think we should ask the question.
All right, Mr. Brockler, what's the people's position?
I don't object to the court trying to figure out a way to get to the heart of the juror's question. I think that that's actually something that this court is empowered to do with juror questions.
Instead of saying the police videos, I'll say the police materials. The next questions are on the form that I have marked as number 203, and there are a few questions on this form as well. The first question is, you mentioned that you do not videotape interviews because the camera can impact the content of the interview. In what way, if at all, does having an observer impact the interview in a similar way. Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
It's an appropriate question, so I will ask it. The next question is, do you feel Mr. Bishop's presence impacted the evaluation in any way? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
I think it's appropriate. I will ask it. And finally, on the same form, if not, what distinction do you draw between the inherent impact you mentioned by videotaping and having an observer? Any objection?
I think it's cumulative of the first question, so I would object to both being asked.
He may answer it with the answers to the first two questions, and so I'll play it by ear. Any objection, Mr. Bruckler?
None, sir.
All right. Next is the questions on the question form that I have marked number 204. If it was not in your position to give recommendations to Dr. Mosier, why would you even have / give initial observations for medication? Oh, wait, let me read it again. Now I understand. If it was not in your position to give recommendations to Dr. Mosier for medication, why would you even have / give initial observations? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Bruckler?
No objection.
I think it's appropriate. I will ask it. The next question on the same form, ethically, why would you not return his phone call even to let him know that you would not be consulting? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Bruckler?
No objection.
All right, I'll ask it without objection. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 205. You stated that flat affect, and flat affect is in quotation marks, is typical of psychosis. Were you aware or made aware that many witnesses and doctors have stated that his affect, and affect is in quotation marks, has almost always been described as flat, and flat is in quotation marks? Did that or would that have any effect on your idea of the psychosis and flat effect relationship during the interview? And then the follow-up is it a possibility that this is typical of him and not something due to the incident? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Bruckler?
No objection.
All right, I think those questions are appropriate. I will ask them. Next, I have questions on the form that I have marked as number 206. The first question is, did Mr. Holmes appear anxious during the interviews? Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
No, sir.
I will ask it. Next, did Mr. Holmes report any anxiety during the interviews? Any objection?
No, sir.
No, sir.
I will ask it. Next, what was the total time you spent with Mr. Holmes? Any objection?
No, sir.
No objection.
And by the way, that's something that's been covered, but I think it's an appropriate question. I think the juror may have missed it, so consistent with my other rulings, I will ask it. Next, did Mr. Holmes ever refuse to answer any questions? Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
No, sir.
I will ask it. Next, was Mr. Holmes able to communicate effectively? Any objection?
No objection.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
I will ask it. And finally, were his pupils enlarged? Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
No, sir.
I will ask it. Next is the question on the form that I have marked as number 207. The first question is, what is catatonia and can you control it? Any objection?
No objection.
Mr. Bruckler?
No objection.
And the next question on the same form, how can you tell how long someone has been psychotic? Mr. King, any objection?
No, sir.
Mr. Bruckler?
No, sir.
I will ask it. And to the extent I'm asking any questions, it's because I'm finding that they're appropriate. Next are the questions on the form that I've marked as number 208. The first question is, you said it was surprising to you that James Holmes seemed annoyed or bored, and annoyed is in quotation marks, and so is bored, during the interview. Have you seen this when interviewing others who have committed murder? How many times, if so? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
And the final question, and I think those are appropriate. The final question, how do you rule out that he really wasn't just bored or annoyed of having to be interviewed? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
I think that's an appropriate question. I will ask it. Next is the question on the form that I've marked as number 209. The question is, you testified that the defendant felt that if he said his plans out loud, he would have to go through with them, so he didn't want to talk about them. In your expert opinion, what does his aversion to having to go through with his plan, and that's in quotation marks, having to go through with his plan, indicate about his understanding of right from wrong? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask it without objection. Next is the question on Form 210. Do you feel like there's a conflict of interest representing the defendant? Actually, let me start again. Do you feel like there's a conflict in interest representing the defense due to your and the defendant's association with neurology and CU school? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask it without objection. Next is the question on the form that I marked as number 211. Is it possible for a person who commits a crime to have a psychotic break caused by the very act of committing that crime, especially if it involves murder? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, sir.
I will ask it without objection. And finally, it's the question on the form that I marked as number 212. The question is, why did the Boulder Clinic close after only 2 years? And I'm assuming that when this juror is asking about the Boulder Clinic, it's asking about Dr. Woodcock's clinic, maybe? That's the only thing I can think of.
He did testify that he moved here to start a clinic in Boulder, in Louisville, but I don't, the court has qualified him as an expert. That was part of the qualification. So I just don't think it's relevant to any of his opinions, Judge, and I'd object.
Mr. Brockler?
Judge, it's relevant because he testified to it, he was asked about it, and he gave an answer. Jurors have a question, and I think it's a fair one to ask.
I will ask it. I agree. It's related to the testimony that came out. So I will ask it. Give me just one more moment. All right, those are all the questions. Are the parties ready for the jury?
Yes, sir.
Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's bring them in, please.
And while they're coming in, Your Honor, if at all possible, we really need to get done with Dr. Woodcock today. It seems like we're going to, but he had to cancel, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, but he had to cancel a whole day of patient visits today already. So.
Okay, all right. Dr. Woodcock, you may resume the witness stand, sir. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Thank you for your patience, folks. Right before the break, Mr. Brockler had finished his recross examination of Dr. Woodcock. Dr. Woodcock has resumed the witness stand. Doctor, I remind you that you are still under oath, and members of the jury, I want to remind you that the court has admitted the testimony of Dr. Woodcock only for a limited purpose. You may consider the testimony of Dr. Woodcock only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Doctor, there are a lot of questions that the jury has submitted, and based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, I have determined that most of the questions are appropriate, and so I will ask the questions now. The first question is, in your professional opinion, do you believe that all people who have delusions and who murder are legally insane?
No.
The next question is as follows. Whose opinion specifically, if you recall, was it that the defendant's apartment devices were set up incorrectly? Or was it a specific agency, and if so, which agency?
I don't recall. That was my impression from looking at the reports that were included in the police reports, but I don't recall specifically.
I will preface the next question by instructing you that you can only answer it if you know, and you cannot speculate. So if this is something that's beyond your expertise or something that you don't know about, then you need to just let us know that, okay?
Very good.
All right, the question is as follows. Is it true that cognitive testing scores can change based on the length of time between testing, who is administering the testing, how he is feeling that day? Could the scores go back up or down if tested again? Could this be affected by medications? So it's a three-part question, and you can only answer any of them if you know.
I do know. The answer to all of them is yes, and that has to be considered in the judgment of the people who are giving the tests, as well as those who are interpreting them.
The next question is, when do you believe that Mr. Holmes's delusions took over his ability to know right from wrong?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, when do you believe that Mr. Holmes's delusions took over his ability to know right from wrong?
I think that was a progression, but it really started at the time he describes the floodgates were opening. And it, I think, progressed from that time on. But it was very significant at that time.
The next question is, does being delusional automatically preclude the ability to know right from wrong or to form a culpable mental state?
No.
Next, does being psychotic automatically do the same?
No.
Next question, if someone is suffering from catatonia, is it possible, in your opinion, for that person to be able to schedule these episodes?
To some degree, there is some ability at times to manipulate that.
The next question, in your experience, is it common for a person with schizoaffective disorder to be or to become violent?
Yes.
The next question, are the questions in the checklist in the insanity defense chapter mandatory to ask in terms of forensic psychiatry and rendering a forensic opinion, or just a suggested guideline?
They're suggested guidelines.
How does a person with schizophrenia change in the early to mid-20s?
The mid-20s is a very common time for schizophrenia to come on, and the degree of change really depends upon the severity, the rapidity of onset, and any preliminary symptoms. So people can go from being very normal, really completely normal, to being, to having a lot of the symptoms of schizophrenia, which include the positive symptoms we talked about, hallucinations, delusions, and the negative symptoms, withdrawing. Sometimes people will come home from college, for instance, and they'll go to their room and they won't come out of their room for a long time. Sometimes until they receive treatment. So there may be a combination of, there's usually a combination of positive and negative symptoms. If someone had prominent symptoms beforehand, that is, they had a lot of schizoid characteristics, they had a lot of trouble with social interactions, they had a fair amount of withdrawal, they had a lot of mood symptoms, then there may be a more sort of gradual progression. So sometimes it's a relatively rapid, severe change, and sometimes it's a more gradual progression. Most of the time it's actually fairly sudden. Over a course of 6 months to a year, the symptoms will develop and become quite severe.
The next question is as follows. Aside from the homicidal ideations, why did you rule out an autism spectrum disorder in that the defendant allegedly had a flat affect and poor social skills for many years, if not always?
That's a very good question, and it was a major consideration, although there are basically two main reasons why I did. One was that this was really very typical for schizoaffective disorder, and the next was that it wasn't very typical for autism spectrum disorder. I think there were some major differences with autism spectrum disorder. One of them, I think, was mentioned during testimony, that he didn't have prominent symptoms until early middle school. That would be quite late for an autism spectrum disorder, but there are also differences in the nature of the social difficulties that he had. Most people with autism spectrum disorders don't have the degree of subjective anxiety that he reports, which was really a central symptom of his from early on. They're very uncomfortable and they're not good at social relationships, but they don't tend to be as anxious as he was.
The next question is as follows. If Mr. Holmes had no empathy for others, as you reported, how did you rule out antisocial personality disorder aside from no rule-breaking history?
I think that, again, that's a very good question, because really it is the lack of the antisocial rule-breaking behavior which really distinguishes this. The lack of empathy is a characteristic of both can be characteristic of schizoaffective disorder. I certainly think it was here, particularly as his psychosis progressed. But it's principally the history of behavior. I did consider that he had an early diagnosis during treatment of the oppositional defiant disorder, but there was not any kind of a consistent history the other of antisocial behaviors of rule breaking. The other point was that I thought in antisocial personality disorder there isn't usually the kind of ambivalence that we saw in multiple aspects of this presentation. It wasn't all the time, but there were evidences of ambivalence, and you usually don't see very much ambivalence at all in antisocial personality disorder. You don't see a sense of struggle, and I think that there was a sense of struggle here.
The next question. Per your testimony, how did you know that Mr. Holmes was psychotic when he went backwards off the bed?
That has to do with several things. First of all, we had, by the time I had seen that video and the time that happened, he had been diagnosed as psychotic in the Student Health Service. I saw him as psychotic, and I didn't have a lot of other information about his treatment then, but in subsequently reviewing the records, there's no evidence at that time that his previously diagnosed and observed psychosis had remitted, and that happened in transition to the sort of florid psychotic break that required the admission to Denver General. So there's no reason to think that he was somehow or other better at that time.
The next question is as follows. When you reviewed the police materials, did you see the calendar with the dates of July 19th or 20th marked with a symbol? And then in parentheses it says, when you concluded the defendant did not know the date of the event.
I do recall that information. My point about, I think Mr. Brockler asked me if on July 12th he had decided he was going to do this. I think he was psychotic at that time, and the assessing his decision-making capacity at that time and through the time that this happened, I think is really obscured by the density of his psychosis. I think that on July 12th he was psychotic and certainly very impaired, and I think he was at the time this happened.
The next question is as follows. You mentioned that you do not videotape interviews because the camera can impact the content of the interview. In what way, if at all, does having an observer impact the interview in a similar way?
I think the impact can be very similar.
The next question is, do you feel Mr. Bishop's presence impacted the evaluation in any way?
I think that it may have impacted it some. I think it would be probably inaccurate to say that there was no impact. Certainly Mr. Holmes was aware that he was there. There was the one incident that we talked about where Mr. Bishop's presence appeared to have impacted Mr. Holmes, but that was really the only time, and I did feel that Mr. Holmes was responsive to my questions. As I said before, he didn't expand on them a lot. I therefore followed them each question up with another question. I don't know how he would have responded if Mr. Bishop hadn't been there, but I felt that his behavior in the interview was appropriate and responsive.
If you think you've already answered this question, then let me know. It's a follow-up question, and the question is as follows. If not, and this is if not relating to the question about do you feel Mr. Bishop's presence impacted the evaluation in any way? So the follow-up question is, if not, what distinction do you draw between the inherent impact you mentioned by videotaping and having an observer?
I think this, in my experience, was somewhat unique. I don't usually have a clinical observer other than a trainee or something like that. This was an initial interview to gather preliminary diagnostic information. It really wasn't meant to be more than that, and I think I probably would have taken a different approach, certainly had a different set of considerations if this was to have been a full-blown forensic examination, but that's not what its purpose was, and that's why I think I was comfortable having Mr. Bishop there. During the interview, if I had thought that having Mr. Bishop there was interfering, I would have asked him to leave.
The next question is, if it was not in your position to give recommendations to Dr. Mosher for medication, why would you even have/give initial observations?
That's a good question. I was in a position to give him my impressions. Part and parcel of those impressions regarding the mental illness and the type of mental illness would have been a recommendation. In other words, if I say someone is psychotic and very ill, the immediate implication is that, well, then why wouldn't you treat them? And we did discuss treatment. with antipsychotics. The point is that I didn't have the role of actually treating him. Dr. Moser hadn't seen him, so he was very interested in my observations, and I provided those to him. Again, part and parcel of the implication of those observations would be medications, and as I recall, one of our discussions was the antipsychotic medications that were available in the jail.
The next question is, ethically, why would you not return his phone call even to let him know that you would not be consulting?
That's a good question, and quite frankly, possibly I should have. I immediately called Mr. King. The impression that I got, possibly this was an incorrect impression, I don't know, was that, the communication was, we're in a meeting about this now, and I'll get back to you. So my impression was that there would be further communication about this between whatever obligation or decision-making capacity that the public defenders, the defense team had, and the jail psychiatrist. I'm not familiar with those relationships or those responsibilities, and so I left it at that point. I did not receive, quote-unquote, permission to call back, and I didn't make the general call that that was the case.
The next question is, you stated that flat affect is typical of psychosis. Were you aware or made aware that many witnesses and doctors have stated that his affect has almost always been described as flat?
Yes, that has been true, and I believe it's true to the present time. The premonitory symptoms here, including flat affect, I think go back to middle school. So I think that that's one of the characteristics. What I tried to point out in my July 2012 observations was that this was still to an extraordinary degree. So, I hadn't seen him before that. There are reports of him since that time. It was certainly my impression this year that although and I reported that there was still a flatness of affect, but it was less than I saw previously. So yes, this is an ongoing characteristic.
The next question is a follow-up question. If you believe you've answered it, then you can let me know. Did that or would that have any effect on your idea of the psychosis and flat affect relationship during the interview?
One of my considerations during the interview was that during the July 2012 interview was that there was a lot going on emotionally. This horrible, horrible thing. He had done this horrible, horrible thing. And so there was this contrast between that historical fact and his affect. And his affect, again, was extraordinarily flat. It was that disparity which was, I thought, clinically significant.
The next question is also a follow-up question. Is it a possibility that this is typical of him and not something due to the incident?
Yes, I think that but I think that you cannot totally separate his illness, which has been fairly long-standing, at least in including the premonitory symptoms, and this fact of the flatness of his affect. But again, I think that even given someone who has a flat affect, who's not very emotionally responsive, certainly what I saw in July 2012 is beyond the range of normal, well beyond the range of normal. Now, it may be that his baseline affect is also beyond the range of normal, but I think that that is part of the premonitory symptoms and the psychosis, and I think that that's supported by the reality that with treatment over time, his affect is more normalized. I think it's still relatively flat, but not as flat as it was before, but he has improved with treatment in that regard.
The next question is, did Mr. Holmes appear anxious during the interviews?
No, not at all.
Next, did Mr. Holmes report any anxiety during the interviews?
don't believe he did during the first one. We talked about that during the second one, and he was able to describe feeling somewhat anxious because I was there, anxious in some situations, and describe his past anxiety. But and he was, I think, able to do so with what sounded to me like some objectivity. So, yes.
Next, what was the total time you spent with Mr. Holmes?
3 hours and 45 minutes.
Next, did Mr. Holmes ever refuse to answer any questions?
No.
Next, was Mr. Holmes able to communicate effectively?
Yes.
And the next question is, were his pupils enlarged?
They were very enlarged the first time I saw him. They were mid-position the second time I saw him.
The next question is, what is catatonia and can you control it?
Catatonia comes in two forms. A waxy flexibility where there's very little movement and positions can be maintained, and hyperactivity. The degree of control is variable. Usually there's not a lot of control, but generally it occurs when people are very, very ill and disorganized cognitively. So there's not an attempt to control it. But I do want to emphasize that I think what he was talking about, control and limiting it to lunch hour and so on, did not represent what we would call catatonia.
The next question is, how can you tell how long someone has been psychotic?
It can be very difficult to tell unless they give an indication of that, either behaviorally or they tell you what their thought process is. People can cover psychosis quite well, and there are degrees of psychosis. There are a number of studies in the literature about people who have chronic hallucinations, for instance, most often auditory hallucinations, and a form of, I guess, mild, minimally functional impairment associated with psychosis, but the vast majority of the time when that's going on, you won't know it.
The next question is, you said that it was surprising to you that James Holmes seemed annoyed or bored during the interview. Have you seen this when interviewing others who have committed murder? How many times, if so?
I haven't interviewed very many people who've committed murder, 4 or 5. And I have not seen it before in those people. What surprised me about it again was, and it wasn't so much surprise as the unusual nature of this, to be in this situation, be in jail after this horrific crime, and appear annoyed and feel and say that you feel bored, and appear to me, someone who's interviewed thousands of people, to be genuine in saying that. That's just an extraordinary emotional expression, and it registered with me.
The next question is a follow-up question, and it is as follows. How do you rule out that he really wasn't just bored or annoyed of having to be interviewed?
I think he was bored and annoyed with being interviewed. And that's what's really extraordinary. In such a situation, again, I want to understand how could that possibly be? And there are a limited number of explanations. And one of them we've talked about is sociopathy. A sociopath may present that way because they don't care. They never care. They don't really have much capacity for caring. Another explanation is that someone is suppressing affect in the middle of a psychotic episode, and that's what I thought was going on here.
The next question is as follows. You testified that the defendant felt that if he said his plans out loud, he would have to go through with them, so he didn't want to talk about them. In your expert opinion, what does his aversion to having to go through with his plan indicate about his understanding of right from wrong? And having to go through with his plan is in quotation marks, and I can read it again if you would like.
Would you please?
You testified that the defendant felt that if he said his plans out loud, he would have to go through with them, so he didn't want to talk about them. In your expert opinion, what does his aversion to having to go through with his plan indicate about his understanding of right from wrong?
I think this was especially relevant earlier on when his psychosis wasn't so severe, when he was still holding on to this goal of being able to pursue neuroscience. And he was, in some ways, using the redirection of his thoughts toward homicidal ideation to keep him on track so that he wouldn't act out homicidal ideation, he wouldn't act out suicidal ideation, and he would continue what he called Plan A. So early on, I think that that's what his struggle was about. But later, as he became sicker, he lost that ability. The delusions became stronger. The sense of compulsion with the delusions became stronger. And he wasn't able to exercise the positive, the healthy side of that ambivalence. And he lost that struggle and acted out.
The next question is as follows. Do you feel like there is a conflict in interest representing the defense due to your and the defendant's association with neurology and CU school?
No. I didn't know Mr. Holmes there ever.
The next question is it possible for a person who commits a crime to have a psychotic break caused by the very act of committing that crime, especially if it involves murder?
I think that would be possible.
And the last question is, why did the Boulder Clinic close after only 2 years?
The Boulder Clinic, I think, is someone's referring to the Neuropsychiatric Institute in Boulder. It closed because the Department of Health decided to impose on the facility, the building, updated building codes. They had waived the updated building codes. We were in an older facility, and they decided to require the building to meet those codes, and the people who owned the program, the company that owned the program, decided not to continue the program.
All right, any follow-up questions based on those questions, Mr. King?
Yes, Judge, just a couple. Sir, you were asked in that one of the more recent questions, is it possible, I think you testified that it was possible that a psychosis could be caused by in going through the murder itself, a murder itself. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Is there any indication, in your opinion, that that's what had happened here, or is it quite clear that the psychosis preceded the shooting by some time?
It's clear, I think, by the evidence that the psychosis preceded the shooting.
With regard to catatonia, well, you described what catatonia is. Is it fair to say that Mr. Holmes actually showed symptoms of catatonia when he was hospitalized in November of 2012 and just prior to that?
That was reported, yes. He had the waxy flexibility form of catatonia.
Reported by doctors and other treatment
That was
folks.
reported at Denver General.
Now, when we're talking about the reporting that he made about being tired and depressed, that he called catatonia, do you think there's any indication that that actually was catatonia, or is that just what the name he put to being tired and depressed, in your opinion?
Yes, I think it's the term he put to it. I don't think it was what we would call catatonia.
You were asked some questions about flat affect and whether Mr. Holmes had always had a flat affect. Is it clear in the history from his family, from childhood friends and acquaintances and neighbors and teachers that Mr. Holmes in fact did not have a flat affect during his early childhood, but that was a change in his personality that happened during middle school and high school?
That's my understanding, yes.
And finally, sir, with regard to antisocial personality disorder, this has come up a couple of times, and I think the other doctors are you familiar that the other doctors have indicated that they didn't feel that Mr. Holmes showed any sign of antisocial personality disorder as well?
Yes.
I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder that are in the DSM-5, and see if you think that it applies to Mr. Holmes or not. Under diagnostic criteria A, is it true that the person would have to have 3 or more of the different listed symptoms there or behaviors there?
That's the way the DSM is often constructed, yes.
1, failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. Any indication that Mr. Holmes repeatedly performed acts that were grounds for arrest?
No.
Deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying use of aliases or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Any indication that Mr. Holmes ever conned people or used aliases for personal profit or pleasure?
No.
Any indication that in this case that he did any of this for personal profit or pleasure?
No.
3, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Did Mr. Holmes demonstrate an inability to plan?
No.
4, irritability and aggressiveness as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. Any indication of Mr. Holmes ever being aggressive as indicated by being in physical fights or assaults?
There was the time when he hit his sister during the basketball game. That's the only one I know of.
And that was when he was a young child?
I think it was in middle school.
Would that qualify as repeated physical fights or assaults?
No.
And is it true that all of these have to have been occurring since the age of 15?
That is relevant, yes, and of course they haven't.
Number 5, reckless disregard for the safety of himself or others. Any indication that he had a reckless disregard?
No.
6, consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. Any indication in the record of those things?
No.
7, lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent or to rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. Possibly?
I don't think prior to this episode, no.
Okay. In addition, the individual has to be at least 18. He certainly is 18, correct?
Yes.
The person in criteria C, there has to be evidence of a conduct disorder with onset before 15 years. Any indication that he had a conduct disorder before he was 15 years old?
No.
And conduct disorder as a child is related to repeatedly breaking the law or assaulting others, things like that. Is that right?
Yes.
And finally, D, the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusively during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
Yes, that would be an exclusion.
So in your opinion, sir, Is antisocial personality disorder a consideration in this case, or really not at all?
It's not with the information we have.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Brocker, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Since we've gone there, Doctor, your last answer, you recall, was based on the information that we have. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And again, I don't want to make more out of this than there is, but Mr. King asked you about, both yesterday and today, about any evidence of the defendant engaging in repeated rule breaking. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And your answer was, no, there's no indication of that anywhere. You recall that?
Yes.
You also recall from your review of the record, though, that within less than 10 months leading up to this event, he'd received 2 separate traffic violations?
I don't remember those, quite frankly.
They could be there, you just don't remember reviewing them.
That's right.
Another thing, you were asked about an element of this antisocial personality disorder, which was the defendant ever having used an alias for purposes of pleasure. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you said, no, there's no indication of that. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And what we know from the stuff sitting in front of you is that the defendant created a completely separate identity as Classic Jimbo at classicjimbo.com for purposes of joining XXXmatch.com, AdultFriendFinder.com, and HornyMatches.com. Do you recall that?
Yes, I believe that was during the escalation of this psychosis.
I appreciate that, but you would agree that, in fact, he did use an alias for purposes of pleasure at some level.
Not the criteria that's listed in there. It was
All right, the objection is overruled.
Go ahead, Doctor. You agree with that?
That would be an example of an alias.
And he used it repeatedly with several different pleasure-seeking social websites.
Yes, during a psychotic break in schizoaffective disorder, which is an exclusion under DSM.
Thank you for adding that in there. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Just to clarify, too, you've agreed that being psychotic and murdering someone is not sufficient for them to be legally insane, correct?
Correct.
You talked about, and this was a question that was asked, interesting, about whether or not he was truly just bored, and that struck you as odd during your July 24th interview. You recall that?
Yes.
Let me just ask you, is it inconceivable to you that a guy who has had nothing but questions thrown at him from the minute he was taken down behind that movie theater on things ranging from the bombs in his house to all this stuff, to even his own defense team and a defense investigator who you admitted had talked with him maybe a day or 2 days even leading up to your conversation, that he would genuinely be bored with conversations about his grades and his family? You agree that's possible?
Yes, that may have been a contributor.
I'm sorry.
Yes, it may have been a contributor.
Again, another small matter, but a follow-up on the juror question. There is a significant difference in the potential for interfering with an interview between a recording device and a human being like Mr. Bishop being in the room, correct?
Yes.
Part of it is the defendant knows who Mr. Bishop is, doesn't he?
Yes.
He knows the role he plays as someone who's on the team that's going to try to defend him, correct?
Yes.
And as we've seen from your notes, Mr. Bishop did not sit behind you idly humming away the way a recorder might. He actually coughed, there was some laughing, and he may have injected an answer in on behalf of the defendant you can't remember. Fair?
Yes.
And you don't know whether or not he made other facial reactions or nods to the defendant during your questions?
Yes, that's correct.
Something else you said when the question was asked, how do you know he was psychotic when he fell off the bed? First thing you said, and tell me if you agree with this, was that, well, he'd been diagnosed as psychotic through the Student Mental Health Services. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now look, those records have all been admitted into evidence. We've heard from Drs. Fenton and Feinstein. Sir, you'd agree with me that they never diagnosed him as psychotic. Right?
Overruled?
Go ahead, doctor.
That may be.
Yeah, in fact, what we heard from both of them and what you read in their reports was they were struggling to figure out what was going on with this guy because of the information he was keeping from them. Fair?
That's correct.
So he was not, as you recall now, diagnosed as psychotic before falling off that bed.
That's correct. Well, I diagnosed him as psychotic before he fell off the bed.
You're right. Thank you. One other thing. You had said, in response to a juror question, that the delusions took over the defendant when he'd indicated the floodgates were open. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And so prior to that, the delusions had not taken over, correct?
That's correct. He was struggling. It was a progression.
But he was still, in your opinion, the delusions not having taken over, he would have been able to consider things like right and wrong and deliberate and intent and all that.
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Doctor, do you remember, is that the Hillary Allen chats? Are they up here? Sir, I'm handing you what has been admitted as People's Exhibit 1046 into evidence. Would you take a look at page 59 of that and see if you actually see that phrase you referenced as the floodgates are open? Do you see that? Up at the top. Tell us what date that was sent.
July 8th, 2012.
Nothing further. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, may Dr. Woodcock be released from his subpoena?
Yes, sir.
All right, any objection?
No.
All right, Dr. Woodcock, thank you. Mr. King, do you want to call another witness? Yes.
Judge, I think we would like to call one.
Or I think we could finish it in 10 or 15.
Okay, that's fine. Let's give it a try. Is that okay with the jury? Is there anybody on the jury who has to leave at 5? Oh, somebody has to leave right at 5. 5:05? Yeah.
We think we can get it.
Okay, we're gonna give it a try. Since relying on lawyers' estimates is such a good idea.
The record should reflect I'm not going to be asking any questions.
That's true. This is true. All right, Ms. Brady, call your next witness.
Your Honor, we'd call Dr. Kimberly Davina.
Is she out there?
She's coming.
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon. Come around here this way. If I could have you raise your right hand for me, please, so that I can administer an oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
All right, please be seated. Please tell us your full name and spell your first, middle, and last names.
Kimberly Ann Indovina, KIMBERLYANNINDOVINA.
All right, thank you. Ms. Brady, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Can you tell us how you're employed?
Yes, I'm a internal medicine hospitalist physician at Denver Health.
And is Denver Health what used to be the old Denver General Hospital?
Yes,
How long have you been at Denver Health Hospital?
almost 3 years now.
And were you there at Denver Health in November of 2012?
Yes,
And do you recall a patient by the name of James Holmes being admitted to the Denver Health Hospital?
yes,
Did you ever see him?
I did not.
Did you ever do any work, and tell us what you do and whether you did any work in relation to Mr. Holmes?
Sure. So I, at the time that he was admitted to the hospital, was the overnight covering physician. I was asked to follow up on some lab tests and make some orders based on those tests.
And are you a doctor? I should have asked you.
Yes.
Okay. What sort of lab tests were you following up on?
Primarily, I was asked to follow up on electrolyte levels, such as a potassium level, and replete that if needed.
And what did you learn about the potassium level, and what did you do as a result?
So I recall that his potassium level was low, and at that point I ordered some supplemental potassium, I believe both in IV and oral forms.
Any other lab work?
I believe that was the only lab work I was asked to follow up on.
Okay. And what does low potassium indicate to you? What are some of the possibilities why someone's potassium would be low?
So typically they're either not taking in enough potassium or they're losing too much potassium.
So if they were not eating enough, would that be one reason?
That would.
Okay. Did you prescribe or ask that any medication be given to Mr. Holmes while he was there?
In reviewing the records, I prescribed a dose of lorazepam, which is a sedative medication. I don't recall the specific circumstances that led to that order.
Do you recall what days in November Mr. Holmes, when he was admitted, when he was discharged?
I believe he was admitted on the 15th and discharged on the 20th of November.
Okay, and what day was it that you prescribed or asked that he be given lorazepam?
It was early morning on the 19th.
Okay. Your Honor, if I can approach the witness, I'm going to show her an exhibit.
Yes,
It'd be D-TR-70.
thank you.
And doctor, can you tell me if you recognize what that is?
So this is a calendar of November 2012.
And if you could just circle the days with that highlighter I gave you, indicating what days Mr. Holmes was at the hospital. And if you could put I gave you a black pen, if you could put your name at the top and then put DHMC, Denver Health Medical Center. And if you could mark on the day on that calendar what day and time it was that you asked that Mr. Holmes be given lorazepam. And what day did you mark?
The 19th.
And what time was it that you asked that he get that
I
drug?
believe the order was entered at 3:31 a.m.
So 3:30 in the morning. And can you briefly again describe for the jury what lorazepam is, why it's given to someone?
Lorazepam is a benzodiazepine medication, which is a type of sedative. It's something we would typically give for anxiety, agitation, or insomnia.
We can have just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, take your time.
And the day that you were looking at the lab about the potassium and you tried to adjust the potassium, what day was that?
That I don't recall.
But it was one of the,
It was one of the days, I believe one of the days prior to the 19th.
would it refresh your recollection if I showed you one of the records? If I can approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Could be, yeah. You think that? Does that help you recall what day it was that you adjusted the potassium?
Yes, so I ordered some oral potassium on the 16th at 23:36.
November 16th?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Is there any cross-examination, Ms. Teach McGuire?
Yes, thank you.
Hello.
All right, sorry about that. You never had any contact with the defendant prior to him coming to Denver Health
No,
in
I didn't.
November. And in fact, while you were at the hospital, you actually had no contact with the defendant whatsoever while you were at the hospital with him while he was present.
That's correct.
So all you did was review a paper chart and look at the levels of the tests that were ordered, and you never had any contact with the defendant.
Correct.
And then since the time he left the Denver hospital, you also have had no contact with him
No,
whatsoever.
I haven't.
All right, and the levels that you noted for both his potassium, well, I'll start with the potassium, were consistent with someone who had voluntarily chose to stop eating and drinking.
Correct. That would be one cause of the potassium level being low.
And also consistent for the magnesium levels, consistent with someone who voluntarily chose to stop eating and drinking.
Correct.
And the lorazepam is consistent with someone who potentially had insomnia at the time.
Yes, like I said, I don't recall the specific circumstances, but insomnia, agitation, anxiety would be the main reasons we would prescribe that medication.
And you actually have no independent memory of why you ordered that drug that night. Is that fair to say?
I don't. Typically, it would be in response to a call from a nurse, but I don't have a specific recollection of that.
And it would be fair to say that you've actually had more contact with the defendant in this courtroom today than you had at Denver Health while he was admitted there.
That would be fair.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
I would just ask to admit Defense Exhibit D-TR-70.
Is there any objection?
No objection.
All right, without objection, D-TR-70 is admitted. There may be a question or two. Apparently, a couple of the jurors don't want you to get out of here at 5:05. Would counsel please approach? the jury has submitted a couple of questions, and based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, I have determined that they are appropriate. The first question is, what was the potassium level? The B period, U period, N period. That could be a W.
It's
do you
a
know?
U.
It's a U? Okay, and I'm assuming you know what that stands for. All right, you may answer the question.
Yeah, the potassium, I believe the lowest potassium level that I saw was 2.9. BUN stands for blood urea nitrogen, which is a way that we measure kidney function. I don't recall what that was, but it would be in the record.
The next question is, can lorazepam make you either catatonic or at least far less responsive?
Yes, that is one potential side effect of lorazepam would be sedation.
Any follow-up questions, Ms. Brady?
Potassium level was, remind us again of what the reading was and then what that means. Like, is it?
So again, I believe the lowest reading I saw was 2.9. That's a reasonably low level that requires repletion. A normal potassium level would be above about 3.5.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Titch McGuire, do you have any follow-up questions?
I do, Your Honor. Were anything about those levels particularly alarming to you?
A potassium of 2.9 tells me that I need to take action, but is in most cases not low enough to cause immediate heart-related side effects.
And when you say you need to take action in terms of making sure you ordered electrolytes for the
Correct.
client at the time?
Making sure that we order potassium repletion. Mm-hmm.
And to be fair, you also ordered several lab tests to make sure that you had all the information you needed at the time, including a basic metabolic rate panel, and a CBC, a complete blood count. You also ordered those labs as well. You also ordered a bladder scan, a CTR catheter review, and checked on his potassium levels.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. No further
All right.
questions.
All right, may this witness be released from her subpoena?
Yes, sir.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, members of the jury, it's 3 minutes after 5, so we made it with 2 minutes to spare. And because there's somebody who needs to leave at 5:05, I'm not going to go through the advisements again. I know that you've heard them a bunch of times. I know you know them by heart. I'll just emphasize before the weekend to please be careful. Make sure that you comply with all of the advisements. All of them are mandatory. All of them are important. Don't take an attitude of nobody's going to find out, or it's okay if we just violate one of these admonishments. All of them have to be complied with, all right? Get some rest this weekend, and I'll see you back here Monday morning at the usual time. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Is there anything we need to talk about before we adjourn on behalf of the prosecution?
No, sir.
No? On behalf of the defense? No? No? All right, have a good weekend. I'll see you Monday. The court will be in recess. Thank you, everyone.